joining us today on Coastal, Progressive, and Rainbow Forum when we're on Society Bites Radio. Today we'll be speaking with Jason T. Gaffney and Kevin Held from their programs, The Bright Side. And they have an incredible repertoire of skits they have done and films and so forth. And I'm going to let them tell you about it, but we're so thrilled to have them here in one of the first of several interviews we're going to be doing with them. Welcome, Kevin and Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And Kevin.
Great.
Yeah.
Listen. Yeah, thank you. Listen, I want you fellows to introduce yourselves a little bit better than what I did there and tell our listeners a little bit more about you. And then we're going to do some talking about Wow, Wowie, Wow, Wow, and explain to our listeners what this is. It's a fascinating story. So I'll let you take over here.
Kevin, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in first. So I'm Kevin, and we've been doing this since 2018. We've been working on the podcast. And before that, Jason and I were partners on a number, like you said, a number of skits and a couple of films together. And the podcast really grew out of an experience of working on set, working together, and having a banter, and a rapport that at one point one of us said, this is fun and we should bottle this. And then, the other one figured out, hey, you really can in the form of a podcast, because that's something that's accessible to people at whatever level of technological experience now. And so we began The Bright Side with Kevin and Jason. That was kind of where it grew from.
Yeah, and one of the reasons, I want to tag on to that. My name's Jason, for all you out there. One of the reasons that we created the podcast was because we were trying to figure out a project we could work on together, and I was feeling a little bit despondent about the way the world was going, and feeling like there's all this sadness in the world, and I wanted to make people laugh. That's kind of been my mission in life since I was a little kid. I used to fall down on purpose to try to make my parents laugh. So I've always been into comedy. And so Kevin and I were talking, and we kind of came up with this, after some brainstorming, we came up with the idea of researching tragedies that happen in history and finding the bright side to them, which is why our podcast is called The Bright Side with Kevin and Jason.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. We have, I know I've listened to some of your work, and I hope more of our listeners will tune in and listen to some more of your work too on the internet out there. Tell us about some of your skits that you have done and things like this, and if you could introduce some of our listeners to those.
Sure.
Sure.
I could talk about the form of of every episode, basically, so there is plenty in the world right now to be despondent over. And so what we want to do is look at other times in history where things were really bad. But then we also take a long view and say, hey, here's something with the hindsight of history good that came out of this thing. So every episode starts with, though there's something going on, there's always something bad going on in the world right now. There's also something good going on in the world right now. So every episode starts with the bright spot, which is something that's going on in the week right now that is happy and it's useful. And so we talk about that for a minute, and then we jump into whatever topic that week that we're talking about, from fad toys of the 70s and 80s to really awful things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, say. And it's not specifically to make fun of tragedies at all. It's just to say that, gosh, humans have made a lot of mistakes, and we sure seem to be still doing that. We keep doing it. And so it's something about the human condition. So we talk about that, and we have fun, and so there's a lot of improv to it. You know, we'll take on different characters. I tend to be the person. I'm Kevin. I tend to be the person who doesn't do much but show up. Jason does all the research, and so he tells me the story of something that happened, and I generally snark at it, make fun of it for about 40 minutes, and then we look what good that came out of that for this week. That's sort of the form of every show.
Excellent. Jason, so you do the research. Tell us some ideas that you've came up with that and how they've turned out with Kevin and you doing the skits that followed them.
So basically, I Google things like hilarious tragedies or wacky history, and I kind of search the internet for kind of unique or unknown historical events. I mean, some of them are absolutely known. The Triangle shirt factory fire was absolutely a known tragedy. But then we have some other ones where, like, I looked up all the different toy fads where, like, certain toys became the must-have commodity. Like Tamagotchi one year was a toy fad where every kid had one, and if you didn't have one, then you had failed as a child. And we kind of poke fun of, and when I'm doing the research, I look to see, like, can this be made fun of in a way that doesn't belittle the tragedy? Are there people to make fun of? Did someone cause the tragedy that we can rag on them? For example, one of my favorite episodes is called Wow, Wowie, Wow, Wow. And that one took place at the Powder Ridge Rock Festival of 1970. And that it's a music festival that was kind of a call and response to Woodstock, except it never happened because the locals had it shut down. And there's tons of stuff that happened at this festival that wasn't really happening that is hilarious and worthy of being poked fun at. And so it's as I'm doing that research, I really try to find episodes where there's something tragic, there's someone who does something wrong, and then they learn from it, and how they can how humanity grows from it. Like, for example, one of my favorite ones is there was a pair of neighbors in San Francisco where this rich guy bought up an entire block to build a mansion, and this other guy didn't want to sell his house. So the rich guy built a 60-foot wall around the house or something like that to block out the sun from the guy's house. And so it's like totally ridiculous, like petty stuff. But what we learned from it is that a law was enacted in California that you can't build a fence on your property above 13 feet, or it's considered a spite fence and has to be taken down. So it's like, I try to find those tragedies where there's something to learn from it and something that people can enjoy and get a little knowledge from.
That's excellent. I've on the Powder Ridge Rock Festival, I was fascinated listening to that and the story, and because I'd never heard of it before, and then and what you brought to bear there. Do you have some others that you could share with us as well, and some other things that you could throw in to add about your research that you've done? I know that was a fascinating story. We just learned that you can't build a fence in California over 13 feet. It's a spike fence, so that's good. And California has got some, as I know from when we were going to build out there in a few years ago, they've got some really strict laws when we were permitting for Palm Springs. And so anyway, what can you share with our listeners about that?
Sure. Another favorite of mine is an episode about the vampire panic of the 19th century in New England. A whole bunch of people got tuberculosis, and people didn't, and it was in kind of very rural areas, and people were afraid of tuberculosis. They didn't know what it was, and so they made up this idea that it was actually vampires sucking the blood out of these sick people. And so when they buried the people, they did pretty gruesome stuff to the bodies to make sure that the people didn't become vampires after they had died. And in some cases, they dug the bodies of dead people back up who had died of tuberculosis and put a stake in them to prevent the other sick people from dying, which, of course, spoilers, it didn't stop them from dying. They had tuberculosis. But that one, or we did one on Typhoid Mary, which I honestly didn't know as much about her until we did the episode, and she was quite an amazing figure. And very topical for today's climate. Kevin, do you want to talk about the Typhoid Mary one at all?
Oh, I do love the Typhoid Mary one. Because but what's interesting about that one too, especially, is that, when you start to dig into something of history like we are doing, one thing that I just love about making the episodes is how much I actually learn from it, So Typhoid Mary doesn't just have to do with infectious disease. It doesn't have to do just with her as a person. It has to do with how in America we deal with the infectious, which is an interesting thing to think about right now, and how we're starting to learn how to deal with the infectious. It also touches on there were sanitariums and how the mentally ill were treated in this country, and that all gets delved into because that person was living at that time or the time that we're talking about. It touches in so many areas. It sort of spreads and goes all sorts of ways. Typhoid Mary is a good example. The thing about one thing I like about our show, and I think that it makes it accessible, is that Jason will start talking to me about something, and it's not that it doesn't just end up being a conversation about history, which would be interesting enough, but just in the course of the conversation, we end up taking a character. So the thing that I think you're talking about skits that people might not know is that we aren't just talking about the situation. Jason will bring something up, and then I will launch into that character, basically. And then Jason will launch into the opposing character or a character in conversation with that first character. We just take, every episode, we could just take 10 or 15 different characters and just explore the imaginary skits that they could be in. So there's a lot of improv. There's an improv element to the podcast that I think is what you're talking about. So that's what's really fun about it, I think, is that we get a little bit of learning in there, but also I'm a 40-year-old man and I'm not above the pratfall. So we just really want to have fun with it. So
one of my
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No worries. One of my favorite moments where Kevin does these amazing characters, and he does an amazing Typhoid Mary impersonation at one point in the episode. But my favorite one of his is actually from the episode where we talk about the new Coke scandal, where Coca-Cola decided to replace their recipe with a new Coke recipe, and we jumped into this like kind of a what do you call those groups? Like a sample group or a test group where people are trying it and they're giving
focus group.
Thank you. Yeah, and so we jump into a focus group, and Kevin starts to be a disgruntled focus group member, and he completely decimated me because on the show we break into laughter, and